Well, hello and welcome to this webinar on the decline of the West, presented by Professor Mark Beeson. My name is Terry Narramore, and I'm the co-vice president of the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which together with UTAS's Island of Ideas is sponsoring this event. Before I introduce Mark, there's a few important things we need to get through first. Firstly, of course, as a reflection of the University of Tasmania's and indeed the AIIA's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. This Island of Ideas program, as well as the presentations co-sponsored by AIIA, are part of an outreach, if you like, to the broader community in these difficult and ancient times that we're going through at the moment. So both of us like to present as many presentations as we can, forums and seminars, to our students, alumni, and the broader community in general. And certainly in these times, we see these as an important service to provide to the community. Just a few housekeeping notes before we commence as well. Your microphones, camera, chat function, raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function you'll see on your screens. A selection of these will be answered at the end of today's presentation, even though we may not be able to get through all of those. Finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on our YouTube and SoundCloud channels at the university. Okay, well, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Mark Beeson. He's well known to people in the field of international relations, and indeed, he's one of our most distinguished scholars in the field of international relations. He's currently at the University of Western Australia, but he's also taught at Murdoch, Griffith, Queensland, York, and Birmingham, where he was also head of the department. Mark's a prolific writer and publisher in the field, with over 150 published articles and book chapters, and several books as well. I'll just highlight the two of his most recent books. Environmental Populism, The Politics of Survival in the Anthropocene, published by Springer in 2019. Rethinking Global Governance, another recent book published last year, published by Macmillan Red Globe. And I think anyone that knows Mark's work values it very highly. I know I do, and I appreciate his contribution to the field. I've used his work often, and I've set many of his works in my courses at the University of Tasmania. So it's a great pleasure to have him with us tonight. Mark tonight is talking about the topic of the decline of the West. What is it, and why might it matter? I think that's an admirably brief and clear title to use, but I'll just say this before we hand over to Mark. And what I particularly like about his topic is that it is truly an international relations topic, rather than something like politics that occurs in countries that aren't Australia. So it encourages us and compels us to think about what being international may mean in this day and age, where people like Trump are retreating from international institutions. The people are perhaps becoming extremely skeptical of globalism, globalization, and so on. And indeed, there's a concern as to what international order, what international society may mean these days. So it's a very important topic, given the relative decline of the United States and the increasingly expanding and rising Chinese influence in the international order. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark, who's coming to us tonight from Perth.
Thanks very much, Terry. That was very generous and thoughtful, and I hope I can live up to my pre-publicity. So before I do anything else, I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you because I hope all being well. Now, can you see that okay? How's that? You should be seeing the opening slide of my little PowerPoint. So I've done a PowerPoint partly so you'll all have something to look at apart from me, and partly to help me remind myself of what I'm going to talk to you this evening. So this particular talk is also available as a published paper with the Global Asia Institute in Hong Kong. And I don't know if Terry's got a copy, but I can certainly pass one on to him, and you can contact me if you want to read the full version of what is a fairly lengthy sort of paper. But it's about a series of issues I've been interested in for some time, and I try to pull together some of my ideas about this, and I'll run them past you, and I'll be most interested to hear what you all think about it. So this is a little kind of overview of some of the issues that I'll talk about and try to give you some idea about. And as Terry mentioned in his introduction, one of the big things that's happening in the world, well, there are two kind of big things, I guess, really. One is about the possible decline of American power. And this was happening even before Mr. Trump came along, but I think he's undoubtedly accelerated the process and undermined some of the aspects and elements of American power, particularly what people refer to as quote unquote soft power. So there's a material aspect to that, and there's a kind of ideational aspect to the decline of American influence and dominance, and that's interesting and important. The other thing, of course, that's happening is that China has rapidly emerged, or possibly one should say more accurately re-emerged, as the great power of the part of the world that we live in. And as I'll explain as we go along, I think China's the most, the rise of China, or the re-emergence of China, I think is the most important thing that certainly happened in my lifetime. And I include in that context the Cold War and various other things that have happened. That's in terms of geopolitics. I think the problems associated with climate change are likely to be even more consequential, but I'll get to that later on. But this particular talk focuses primarily on this kind of rise of China and the decline of the United States. But there's more at stake in all of this than simply great power politics, because the United States and China in different ways represent different ways of thinking about and acting in the world. And I think that has enormous consequences, particularly for countries like Australia, which is very closely strategically aligned to the United States. And of course, like many other countries in the region, China is our greatest trade partner and economic partner. So there's a lot at stake, not just for the United States and China, but for the way the world operates and the impact it's likely to have on some of the lesser powers in the world, like Australia, but everybody else around the world as well. So that's the kind of broad context I'm going to talk about this evening, and think about some of the kind of issues that flow from it. So let me say something about the rise of the West. And I should say at the outset that I'm a kind of product of the rise of the West. I grew up in England, which is in Europe, as we know, and European civilization, it's a very unfashionable thing to talk about, but it has produced some interesting and important ways of thinking about the world, which are, in my view at least, valuable and have helped to provide a universal understanding for the world, at least in the sense of some of the kind of scientific principles and methodology that have helped us to think about our place in the world and what it means to live on this particular planet. And the fact that we now know unambiguously, I've known for hundreds of years, that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa. This is an unambiguously true fact about material reality, that what you or I may think about it makes absolutely no difference. And it doesn't matter that this was a reality that was discovered in the quote unquote West rather than somewhere else. It holds true for everybody everywhere. And I think the fact that we know that there are scientific facts, and there are some things that are unambiguously true and universal, is an important reality for all of us to contemplate and think about, and it has universal implications. Now, clearly, when we get into the issues of values, norms, judgments about the best ways to live and the best ways to order societies, either at the national or the international level, things get a bit more complicated. But the idea that we can say something unambiguously true about material reality at all under any circumstances is, I think, pretty important and pretty encouraging in some ways. And it does indicate that it's possible to make a degree of intellectual progress in the way that we think about things and the way that we order our own societies. Now, this is important at any time, but it's particularly important at the moment because, as we all know, there has been a systematic attempt to cast doubt on the validity of scientific evidence about the possible ways of thinking about the best ordering of society and politics. And the fact that China and the United States subscribe to very different ideas about the best ways of organizing political life and economic life, for that matter, is striking and important. And the fact that somebody like Donald Trump dismisses out of hand the idea that there is factual evidence about particular sorts of issues because it suits his political agenda to do so is interesting and important, but it casts doubt on otherwise fairly incontrovertible kinds of ideas. For example, like the existence of climate change and environmental degradation. So that's the kind of context that we're having to deal with, the fact that we have had some real intellectual development with universal implications, which is being systematically undermined by one of the countries that's most associated with championing that in the past. So that's a pretty interesting and paradoxical state of affairs. Now, when we're thinking about the rise of the West and we're thinking about civilizations, which is a pretty unfashionable way of thinking about the world, it has to be said, there are some striking features of the development of the West and the fact that the West, and Britain in particular, played a surprisingly large role in the development of capitalism and industrialization and some of the technological innovations that underpinned the rise of first Britain and then Europe more generally, and the fact that some of these institutions and innovations that were developed in the West were exported to the rest of the world, often under fairly unpleasant circumstances through imperialism and colonialism. But it's interesting that there isn't a part of the world at the moment that isn't, at least notionally, governed by a nation state. Now, clearly, some of these nation states aren't doing terribly well and are failing and causing problems for their own citizens and the rest of the world at times. But it's striking that that form of political institution and order has become the kind of default setting for everybody around the world. And the other thing to recognize, of course, is that just because you have a nation state, that doesn't mean you're going to have a democracy to go with it as well. And some people have made, Francis Fukuyama, for example, have made some famous and, as it turned out, inaccurate claims about the inevitability of democratic transition and the idea that everybody sooner or later would kind of sign up to being a democratic state like the United States, like Australia, like Britain. That simply hasn't happened. And the big exemplar and the most important influence in this context is the rise of the People's Republic of China. Because China is unambiguously not a democratic state, it's an authoritarian regime, and there is absolutely no guarantee that China is going to replicate the European experience, despite the fact that China has clearly developed many of the same kinds of economic, technological practices and innovations that have underpinned the rise of the West economically and militarily, of course, despite the fact that China has adopted many of those kinds of practices, it hasn't become democratic, and there's absolutely no guarantee that it will in the future. In fact, there's no guarantee that democracy will survive full stop. And that's partly as a consequence of the kind of unforgiving environmental situation that's rapidly emerging around us, but also because under the Trump administration in particular, the commitment to supporting democratic principles and institutions in America, never mind around the rest of the world, is not as clear-cut as it once was, despite some of the lofty rhetoric that occasionally accompanies American foreign policy declarations from time to time. So that's another kind of important paradox to keep in mind, I think, when thinking about the possible rise and indeed the decline of the West and the failure for other states and parts of the world to embrace some of the principles that we associate with the rise of the West at different times. So let me just say a little bit about the world that America made, and this is a plagiarized title from a very good book by Robert Kagan, who's a very conservative commentator in America, but he's one of the people on the right or the conservative side of American politics who realizes what's at stake with the Trump administration in particular, backing away from some of the kind of foundational principles that we've associated with American power and American influence since the Second World War. And it's worth remembering, I think, that America was always going to be a great power. It's a country that is unambiguously blessed, if only by geography, because it has weak or friendly neighbors to the north and south and oceans to the east and west. So it's geographically and indeed geopolitically very fortunately positioned in the world. And the size, the resources, the number of people in America and the dynamism of the American people and economy meant that it was always going to be an important power. What was less clear, I think, to everybody else perhaps, was that American people might assume they'd kind of got a God-given role to play in the international scheme of things that became associated with this idea of American exceptionalism, that America was destined to play this particularly pivotal role in international affairs since it became an independent nation. Now, clearly, the fact that America is still the most powerful country in the world gives America a potential to play precisely that kind of role, for better or worse, in the international system. And significantly, in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was able to institutionalize some of those kinds of principles and norms that were initially associated with the United States. It was able to use particular sorts of international institutions, which I'll say more about in a second, to promote a particular view of how the world should be ordered. And the bipolar struggle that emerged after the Second World War between the United States and the Soviet Union gave the Americans a chance to really consolidate those values and principles, at least within the capitalist sphere of influence. And one of the ways that they did this was by creating a set of institutions that helped to promote this liberal international order. And this applied to East Asia as well. And one of the great paradoxes, I think, of American power and the world that they helped to create after the Second World War is that it actually created highly successful competitors, firstly in Japan and a reconstructed Europe as well, for that matter, but more recently in China. China's been one of the principal beneficiaries of the world that America helped to create and this institutionalized order. And so one question to kind of ask about this is, who won the Cold War? At one level, clearly it was the United States, because its values and capitalism became the default economic order in the world. But at the same time, they created this formidable competitor in the form of China in particular, which doesn't subscribe to all of the aspects of the liberal international order. And that's kind of interesting and potentially very important. Now, you've probably all heard of or familiar with Bretton Woods, but it's worth saying something briefly about how significant this was in terms of American hegemony and why this particular aspect of American power and influence may be beginning to unravel before our eyes. Now, you've probably all heard of the Washington Consensus as well. That's also known sometimes as neoliberalism, but it's an idea that emerged from the disasters of the period between the First and Second World War, when we, like today in many ways, we had an unprecedented economic crisis. And the big idea after the Second World War was we should never repeat that crisis again, and we all hope that's not going to be the case. But there were a series of institutions that were created with the specific objective of stopping that from happening again. And these are the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank being the most important economic institutions that were designed to keep the global economy functioning, open, liberal, and integrated. And you have to say, they worked pretty well in many respects. At the same time, there were a series of strategic alliances that were created under the auspices of American hegemony or leadership, depending on what you want to call it. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe, which ultimately helped to consolidate the European Union and this integrated market and strategic arrangements in Western Europe. But also in this part of the world as well, the Americans established a series of what are called hub and spokes bilateral relationships during the Cold War with countries like the Philippines, South Korea, and us, of course. So interestingly, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States used its, what we now describe very fashionably as its geo-economic influence, the fact that it was the biggest economy in the world by far after the Second World War, and it could use aid and trade to encourage allies to sign up and to be part of this American sphere of influence, if you like. And Japan's renaissance from being a kind of irradiated wasteland during the Second World War to become the second biggest economy in the world by the 1970s was a quite extraordinary testament to the effectiveness of that geo-economic leverage and influence and the ability of the Americans to create a particular world order that included not just an economic aspect of it, but a strategic one as well. So this idea of geo-economic power as applying economic instruments to advance geopolitical ends is an extremely important part of America's period of international dominance, but also arguably it's becoming an increasingly important feature of China's expanding influence in the world as well. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So that was as the world was up until fairly recently, and it's become dramatically obvious because we're seeing the re-emergence of trade wars, we're seeing the so-called decoupling of key parts of the international economy. We're seeing the rise of authoritarian powers who are challenging American dominance, China not being the only one in this regard. But I think although Trump has undoubtedly added to these problems as far as America is concerned and undermined certainly the aspects of America's so-called soft power, because he's managed to alienate many of America's key allies, but he's also managed to undermine their strategic position as well, because Trump famously takes what's been described as a transactional approach to foreign policy, in which he expects allies to pay for the security guarantee that allegedly America provides, and which countries like Australia live in hope that Trump would actually fulfill if we found ourselves in serious trouble. There's a big question mark about whether Trump would, but I think it's important to recognize that many of these kinds of problems, many of these kinds of uncertainties, and the decline in America's material power and perhaps its willingness to play this kind of international role as an economic actor and particularly as a strategic actor, many of these kinds of things were in question even before Trump came along. And it's remarkable that George W. Bush is now regarded as being something of a serious and sensible policymaker. And yet here's the guy who authorized and dreamt up the disastrous invasion of Iraq, which I think just about everybody agrees now was perhaps the greatest unforced strategic error in the 20th century, and we're still living with the consequences of a destabilized Middle East, and that arguably the cost and the expense to America of trying to impose order in the Middle East led in part at least to the global financial crisis, the GFC, which further undermined American power and influence in the world, and indeed the attractiveness of the American economic model. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated either, because many people look at the United States at the moment and they see not only political chaos and mayhem domestically, but a seriously undermined economic presence in the world, because America is far and away the greatest debtor economy in the world, of course. If it was any other country, the IMF would have been in there a long time ago telling them to sort themselves out and get their house in order. But because it's the most powerful country in the world, and the United States still has a good deal of influence over the IMF, that has not happened and is not likely to happen either. It's also worth pointing out that Barack Obama, who I think was and still is one of the more important and quite inspiring political figures, particularly when judged against what's on offer at the moment. But he's been one of the better American presidents, in my view, but he wasn't able to entirely repair the damage that George W. Bush had done, and he wasn't able to really respond in the way that some people hoped he would to the challenges of restoring order in the Middle East, or to dealing with China, because Obama had the famous pivot to Asia, as it was called, which was supposed to re-establish the United States as an Asia-Pacific, or indeed an Indo-Pacific power, as we call it these days. But that didn't entirely happen. And that strategic confrontation between the United States and China is one of the kind of defining features of the international system today. And I think it's partly as a consequence of, it's not just China rising, but arguably it's partly about America declining, at least relative to the People's Republic of China. So China's rising, but so are a lot of other would-be rising powers and authoritarian regimes. And it's interesting that within this kind of context, some of the most important regimes that were associated with the rise of the West, or American hegemony more particularly, have begun to lose authority and even legitimacy in the eyes of many people. Now, I'm a big fan of the European Union. I won't bore you with my views unless you actually ask me to, which I'd be delighted to do so. But I think the European Union is arguably one of the greatest creations in history, because it transcends some of those kind of national differences and boundaries. And if the European Union's done nothing else, it's helped to pacify one of the most violent places on the planet, and that's Western Europe. And if you know anything about the history of Western Europe, you'll know what I'm talking about. The European Union is in real trouble at the moment, trying to deal with a series of intersecting crises that defy easy solution, and many people in Europe have lost confidence in the European Union to be able to deal with some of these problems. And so there's a question about their legitimacy as a consequence. Donald Trump has been doing his best to undermine the United Nations and the World Health Authority in particular, World Health Organization in particular, because it suits his particular domestic agenda to do so. He's no fan of multilateral institutions, and this would be unfortunate at any time that the leader of the free world and the leader of the United States and one of the creators of these multilateral institutions would be systematically undermining their position and their legitimacy. It would be unfortunate at any time, but at a time when we really need global institutions or multilateral institutions to try to address some of the key problems that the world is facing, both economically, strategically, and of course, environmentally. This is especially unfortunate, it seems to me. There are some new groupings on offer. The BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, sometimes South Africa too. It's interesting for a variety of reasons. It hasn't got that far so far. The G20 was the great hope for Australia because we're in it and we think it's a good thing, of course, because we get a seat at the big table. Seemed like a good idea. The idea that there are more people involved is a good thing in principle, but it's harder to get agreement. And the G20, apart from addressing the former global financial crisis, hasn't really done that much. And maybe it's unfair to expect it to address problems that it was never designed to resolve in the first place. Interestingly, China is seemingly attempting to build a parallel series of institutions in which it may be able to play a bigger role than it does in some of the institutions that were established by the United States. So the AIIB is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and this is the kind of funding part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's big master plan for the world, and which makes the Marshall Plan, which the Americans rolled out in the aftermath of the Second World War, look pretty small and unambitious by comparison. So that's pretty interesting, just as an ambition for China to be trying to put into place. Whether it's going to actually be realized, whether China will prove to be immune to some of the problems that are affecting the other capitalist economies in the world, and I think China is essentially a capitalist economy, albeit a state-directed one these days. Whether China will prove to be immune to some of these problems is an open and interesting question, as is China's strategic ambitions and goals for the future as well. And in the United States at the moment, there are some very prominent scholars, people like Graham Allison, who have made a name for themselves by predicting that the world is in the grip of an unfolding process of hegemonic transition in which China is seeking to challenge the dominance and authority of the United States and we're seeing a kind of replication of what's called the Thucydides trap, which was the war between Sparta and Athens a couple of thousand years ago. And the argument goes that this is the way the international system works. Rising powers will always seek to challenge the position of dominant powers. There's something inevitable and unescapable from this kind of great power dynamics between rising and falling powers. Now, I personally don't think there's anything inevitable in life, apart from death and taxes, of course. But it's interesting that many serious strategic analysts in both the United States and China do think that something in this kind of way of thinking about the world, and there's a certain inevitability about the way people will respond and the kind of strategic policies that they'll put in place if they think this is the way the world works and this is the way their opposite numbers are thinking about the world as a consequence of that. And that's a pretty dangerous state of affairs, it seems to me. Let me briefly say, I don't know how long I've got, but I'll briefly just run through a couple of slides and make a couple of brief points. This is about the attractiveness of the People's Republic of China as an alternative to the United States. And I think this shouldn't be underestimated. As I mentioned, there are plenty of things that could go wrong in China, and if they do, it'll be catastrophic and it'll be unpleasant in my view. That's my guess, because one of the great things about democracies is they are a bit more resilient to internal and external shocks. We hope, and we're getting a big test of that theory in the United States at the moment. But I think authoritarian regimes are famously brittle, and if things go wrong, they can fall over fairly rapidly. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But as far as China at the moment is concerned, it's been hugely, unbelievably successful. It's part of a tradition of state-led development in East Asia. And the sheer size of the Chinese economy means that it has a degree of economic leverage over all of its trade partners. And everybody in East Asia, their biggest trade partner is China, and China is increasingly willing to use that leverage to encourage its trade partners to behave in particular ways. And that includes us, of course. And you can see what a problem that is for our government, trying to strike a balance between the importance of China as a trade partner and the importance of America as a strategic partner. I mentioned briefly the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is the biggest kind of project of its type in the history of the world, bar none. If it works, it will be incredibly consequential, and a lot of people and countries will end up in a kind of Chinese sphere of influence. And it's interesting that we're even talking about spheres of influence again in a way that people did in the 19th century, when European powers and the rise of the West were kind of demarcating geopolitical orders, not only in Europe, but around the world. And we're seeing, I think, a return to something like that again. And people are talking about a so-called new Cold War. And that's another way of describing this kind of reemergence of particular spheres of influence. And one of the big things that will shape the 21st century is whether America remains committed to being a major power in this part of the world, whether you call it the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. At some stage, maybe, the Americans have to decide whether it's worth risking an outright conflict with China about their position in the region and about China's emerging sphere of influence in our part of the world. In those circumstances, is it possible for China to assume a leadership role? Now, I've mentioned a few of these things already, so I'll just try and keep this reasonably brief as well. Despite the fact that China is developing alternative institutions, is a major part of the BRICS grouping, it's worth asking, who are China's friends? Yes, there's North Korea, and yes, there's Pakistan, but as the old joke has it, with friends like that, etc., etc. So it's striking that America, despite Trump being in charge and all of the damage he's inflicted on the United States and the international order, there are still plenty of countries around who are enthusiastic supporters and allies of the United States, and we are a classic example of that in Australia. So China is developing more influence. There is a kind of model, but it's not clear whether other countries could emulate it if they want to, or whether they are increasingly concerned about being absorbed into a Chinese sphere of influence. And there's a degree of pushback against that at the moment, which a smarter American administration might actually be able to get some mileage out of, because not everybody's thrilled about China becoming bigger, more powerful, partly because it's an authoritarian regime. So there's potential leverage for the United States as well, but I don't think Trump's the man to really take advantage of it. So let me briefly wrap up, so we've got a bit of time for Q&A, because I'll be very interested to hear what you all think about this. So the basic argument I've been trying to make in this very rapid fire presentation is that I think at least America's standing, its reputation, and its place and authority in the world was diminished even before Donald Trump came along. But he's really added to it. And I think the emergence of coronavirus and the absolutely appalling handling of the pandemic in the United States by the Trump administration, and the contrast between that and the way that China did it, I think is striking and instructive. That's not to say that China was without fault, because clearly authoritarian regimes don't like the bright light of publicity being shined upon them, and China undoubtedly tried to cover up their responsibility and the outbreak in the first instance. But once they realized what the stakes were, the authoritarian regime cracked down, and you have to say, pretty effectively responded to that particular crisis. The contrast with America is really striking, and I think a lot of people have drawn the kind of appropriate conclusions. And it's not over yet in the United States. No less a person than the Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman suggested in the New York Times a few weeks ago that America could be on the brink of a civil war. Now, that's a pretty big call, but when you look at some of the things that have been happening in the United States recently, the Black Lives Matter phenomenon, there's a fracturing of the internal politics and even the society in the United States. That is in itself, I think, a reflection of the lack of commitment to a set of principles and values that once were championed by the United States, and I think were a really significant part of America's identity domestically and in the world. And I think this kind of political crisis that's unfolding is opening up a political space in which it's possible for authoritarians to be able to position themselves at least as being slightly more competent when it comes to domestic politics than the United States is under the Trump leadership at the moment. As I mentioned before, authoritarian regimes can collapse rapidly, and we can't be certain what's going to happen in China. I think they're going to have some formidable problems, as are we all, in the future. And this problem of the so-called bad emperor syndrome is a real problem for China. So what do you do if you finally decide, well, maybe Xi Jinping's not the man for this job after all, and it would be nice to get somebody else in? He is, after all, the president for life. But let's not forget, this may not be an exclusively Chinese problem, because what do we do if Donald Trump doesn't accept the result of the forthcoming election, if he gets defeated by Joe Biden, which I think many people hope he will? But if he doesn't accept the result, if he contests it, it's not impossible that America could have its own version of the bad emperor syndrome and the difficulty of getting rid of Donald Trump. I mean, the big point to make about all of this, I think, is that the world at the moment, if there's one thing it needs, it's international cooperation, but it's simply not getting the leadership, particularly from the United States, but just about anywhere else at this particular point in time. And that's most unfortunate, to say the least. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks very much, Mark. Very fluent presentation there. And I think you've raised a number of significant points. And I guess we're all sort of agreed we're transitioning to something else. But if we want to have a sensible discussion about where that might be, we need to know those important signposts that you've covered there. So thanks very much for that. And I'll try and put some questions to you now. We've got far more than we can get through. So my apologies in advance if we don't quite get to your particular question that you may have posted. So let's go with the first one here, which is quite a common one here in Australia, I guess. Mark, can Australia align itself satisfactorily with both the US and China? Would China's leaders have the political trade skill to understand what Australia is doing in this new international climate?
So the question's about the difficulty of deciding how to negotiate this very, very difficult challenge between America's strategic importance and China's economic importance. And this is not a problem that's unique to Australia. Indeed, this is something that the whole East Asian region, Indo-Pacific region, whatever we want to call it, is also trying to come to terms with, including places like Japan, because Japan's biggest trade partner is also China. And I think that kind of relationship between Japan and China illustrates that just having a good economic relationship or an important economic relationship is not enough to transform bilateral relations and improve diplomatic relations between different countries. And I think that's partly where Australia is at as well, because we want to have a good economic relationship with China, but there's growing anxiety about China's influence domestically in this country, about the strategic implications of its rise, and about China's ability to be able to interfere in Australia's domestic politics. And I think these are all valid concerns and things that policymakers are right to fret about. What you do about that is an open and interesting question. Now, my suggestion, for what it's worth, and this is one that is studiously ignored by everybody in Canberra, but I think Australia has an opportunity to actually make something of this much discussed but seldom seen middle power diplomacy, and to actually form deeper, more consequential relationships with some of our middle power neighbours, and to try to do what we can to persuade not just China, but also America to behave better and to act more responsibly in upholding a stable international economic and strategic order from which everybody benefits. I don't think anybody thinks there's anything to be, apart from possibly Donald Trump, to be gained from having a trade war between China and the United States, and much less an actual outright conflict. So we're all in the business of trying to avoid those kinds of outcomes. The question is, what can modestly credentialed countries like Australia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, what can they do to make this happen? And I think if they can do anything at all, it's by clubbing together and trying to make that kind of middle power diplomacy thing actually work in practice.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We'll try another one from, I think it's Itzik Rabanovitz. Is it possible that democracy has failed and that civilization, promise, should be looking for another system?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's impossible to answer. Obviously my hope, because I grew up in, and this is the thing about the decline of Western civilization, if you like, and people are talking about this in a serious way. And there are a truckload of books available at the moment which make very plausible arguments about the problems confronting democracy and the inability of democracies generally to wrestle with really difficult and global problems, particularly things like the environmental challenge. And I won't depress the audience too much by unburdening myself about my views about it, but I have to say I'm not radiantly optimistic about the prospects for us dealing effectively with climate change in the time available to us. And I think that's the biggest challenge facing democracies and capitalist systems generally, because I don't think you need to be a Marxist to recognize that there's potentially a fundamental contradiction between an ever-expanding capitalist economy and the finite limits to the planetary boundaries that are becoming increasingly evident to us. So whether democracies are any more capable or less capable of responding to these kind of challenges than authoritarian regimes are is an open and interesting question. But I'm certainly not looking forward to the prospect of authoritarian regimes being the kind of endpoint to the challenge of dealing with environmental degradation and global warming, because that doesn't make me feel any more optimistic about life. But clearly, this is a really big and consequential problem that our policymakers, I don't think, have really kind of grasped. And there is a big question to be asked about whether the current generation of policymakers around the world are really up to the job of actually recognizing some of the real and immediate and increasingly visible challenges that are in front of them, and having the kind of requisite imagination to be able to do something about it. And I think there's a big open question about policymakers of every stripe. I mean, you've only got to look at Bolsonaro and people like that, who's an authoritarian, but a complete and utter bonehead, I think might be the technical description, and clearly not somebody who's going to inspire a very useful response to that particular challenge. Okay,
thanks, Mark. There's one here from Asim Das. hasn't America's economy and social integrity been declining for quite some time, e.g. pre-George W. Bush?
Has America been in decline for quite some time? Well, I think if you measure influence by America's share of GDP, immediately after the war, it was getting on for 50% of global GDP. That's the Second World War. These days, don't quote me on this, I think it might be 18, 20%, something like that. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. But the point to make is that it has been declining, and economic power and material structural power in the international system is worth something. Quite how you operationalize that and make it important is often a tricky thing to do, as China is discovering at the moment, as it gets increasing amount of pushback. But the fact that it's an asset that can be exploited, I think, is unambiguous. And there are all kinds of interesting but slightly technical debates about America as providing the world's reserve currency, and the fact that it can pay its bills in its own currency. Those kind of privileges are only available to kind of one country at a time. At the moment, it's still the United States, but if people lose confidence in the American economy, or even more confidence than they have, there's a question about what that will mean for the United States. But there's also a big question about, could anybody really replace them? And what would the world look like if we didn't have confidence in one economy to provide the kind of collective goods of an international currency and a more or less stable international economic order? So these are big and important questions at a time when countries all around the world are racking up unbelievable amounts of government debt to try and get us through this crisis, as they should. But what the consequences of this are, how we get out of this, how we eventually pay it back, is an interesting and open question, which I don't have the answer to. I don't think anybody does at this stage, interestingly enough.
Okay, I can give you one of Lisa Fuller's questions here. What are your thoughts about China's 21st century colonizers?
China's 21st century
colonizers as a kind of imperialist or colonizing power.
So it's an interesting question. I think this thing about China as an alternative developmental model, you can see how some countries that aren't terribly democratic, not interested in adopting all of the kind of principles of the so-called Washington Consensus, might look to China as a fairly accommodating source of trade and investment and genuine infrastructural renewal of a sort that countries would actually welcome and value. Having said that, it's interesting that the People's Republic of China, which is allegedly a communist country, as the label tells us, is actually being accused of neo-colonialism in parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world. And as I mentioned before, there is some concern amongst countries that have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, about being caught in so-called debt diplomacy, the idea that China may seek to use its geo-economic leverage to demand closer allegiance, to demand favors for Chinese corporations, because it's striking that when China goes into places to provide much needed infrastructure, it's generally Chinese corporations and labor force that does all of the literal heavy lifting in providing all of this kind of stuff. So the benefits are tangible and real. If you get a new railway put in, it's a new railway and it's useful. But some of the spin-off benefits in terms of actually transforming the local economies in a useful and productive way and integrating them more fully into the global economy, there's a debate about how fully that process has gone forward and what the implications of that are. But I think it's interesting and striking that China does get described as having a kind of neo-colonial and proprietorial attitude towards some of the countries that it has seek to exert an influence over.
Okay, and we might have to make this one the final one, Mark. It's not surprisingly about COVID-19. COVID-19 is a bit like being invaded by another planet. How has its advent affected your thinking?
how has the COVID-19 thing affected my thinking? Well, without wanting to bore everybody with my views about the environment, but I think the environment, for what it's worth, is the problem that we all face as a species. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say. Now, the good news about this is, if there is any, is that it might encourage a sense of all being this together, and finally a kind of recognition about the nature of the collective problems and dilemmas that we all face as members of a common humanity. Now, that's the wildly optimistic take on this. At the moment, the response to environmental challenges has been woefully inadequate. The degree of cooperation and collaboration that we might hope to see has simply not been there. But I think, to get back to the COVID-19 thing, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a direct consequence of human beings' expansion into the natural environment and having an impact on the natural environment that doesn't normally occur. And the fact that we're being exposed to pathogens and viruses that we formerly weren't is a consequence of our actions in some ways. And people who are far more knowledgeable about these kinds of things than I am think that this is going to be, to use that dreadful cliche, the new normal. If we get rid of coronavirus, it won't be too long till another one comes along, because we're creating the preconditions within which these kinds of viruses can flourish and take hold and spread exponentially because of the paradoxical impact of globalization, that we can all fly around the world, destroying the environment as we do, of course. Well, we can all fly around the world, but we take these viruses with us, and they can rapidly transmit themselves around the world as well. So I think in some ways, the COVID-19 thing is kind of an interesting and paradoxical window into an alternative kind of future. But it's a future that we might not want to embrace, because it probably means that people like me don't fly endlessly around the world going to conferences that I could do in precisely the way I'm doing tonight. I mean, I could have flown over to Tasmania and shaken hands with everybody and had a good time and gone out to the pub afterwards for a drink with all of my colleagues in Tasmania, which would have been fantastic. But I would have contributed in a small way to the very environmental problems that it seems to me that we actually need to do something about in the very short period of time that we have an opportunity to do so. And it means people like me, people like all of the people probably tuning into something like this, need to take seriously and do something about. And I'm not sure that we have kind of got that message, not least because some of the people who are in a position to actually give us that message are either reluctant or incapable of doing so, because they just either don't or won't get it in the way that they need to do. So this is why I'm afraid that, given the opportunity to unburden myself on this particular topic, I feel compelled to do so, because I just think it's the most kind of urgent problem that we collectively face. And the kind of good news, such that it is, about COVID-19 is it's yet another reminder of how intimately connected we are with the natural environment, and how it can come back to bite us if we don't take the right kind of actions and recognize the consequences of the actions that we are having on the natural environment. So I'm sorry, there's a bit of a gloomy note to end on, but not an unimportant one.
All right, thanks again, Mark. And we'll leave it there. And thank you very much for your generosity. And we'll hope to take you up on that drink sometime. Meet up and go out for a drink. Thank you very much again.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.